The Hall of Fame game didn't feature any starters or even a fourth quarter, but it did give us some new preseason fan favorites, and it answered some of our questions about the rotations on this Chicago Bears depth chart.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On the show today, we recap the Bears' first preseason game, the Hall of Fame game, headlined by a big performance by quarterback Brett Rypien and wide receiver Collin Johnson. But we'll also look at some of the other winners and losers from the Hall of Fame game and get some updates on how this offensive line and defensive line rotations are going so that we get a better sense of who's going to make the 53-man roster at those key positions, plus a couple other updates on position battles across the roster that we got an extra glimpse into in this shortened preseason game. But even in 2.5 or 2 2/3 quarters, 2 quarters plus most of the third quarter, we did get to see a very strong connection right away between quarterback Brett Rypien, the Bears' third-string quarterback, and the backup wide receiver Collin Johnson. Now, maybe the casual Chicago Bears fan might not have known a lot about either of those players or maybe even heard any of those names before, but Johnson was a guy who was on the practice squad a lot last season, a big-bodied wide receiver that we saw use that big body effectively in this game. And then Brett Rypien is the number 3 quarterback behind Tyson Bagent. Bagent only really playing the first drive or so in this game. And Rypien really looked like one of the better number 3 quarterbacks in the NFL. It looked like he was better than the quality of players he was playing against in this game. It's a preseason game, so we're never going to read too much into it, but it raises an eyebrow when he goes 11 of 15 for 166 yards and 3 touchdowns. Pretty close to, but not quite a perfect passer rating. 73% completion in there. Of course, no interceptions, no turnovers in that performance as well. And 3 of those completions went to Collin Johnson for 56 yards and 2 touchdowns. So a very clear connection between wide receiver and quarterback. But I think the most interesting thing about that connection is that after the game, Brett Rypien said at training camp practices, he thought he threw one pass to Collin Johnson throughout practices. The only time in training camp where Rypien has been the quarterback on the field and Johnson has been the receiver on the field. It happened to be kind of a deeper back shoulder throw like we saw Johnson make a few of in this game, but it's not like that's something they had been able to drill over and over and over again throughout these training camp practices. This was kind of a newer connection, or a newer pairing at least, of these two guys on the field at the same time, throwing with each other at the same time here. And that's kind of what makes the preseason cool, right? When you can see guys step in and make plays like this. Certainly for Rypien, it gives you a heightened level of confidence in him as the number 3 quarterback, certainly compared to what the Bears had last season in Nathan Peterman, who even in the preseason didn't really show you a ton to be super excited about. And then obviously prior to that in his NFL career had shown you plenty to be concerned about. Rypien, on the other hand, has played, a handful of games in his NFL career across multiple teams, has always been a journeyman number 3 quarterback type. But for him to come into this game and play well really goes a long way into solidifying some of that confidence in what the Bears have behind Caleb Williams. There shouldn't be any scenario in which Rypien takes the field in a regular season game this year. I don't think he's going to come in and necessarily unseat Tyson Bagent just yet as the number 2 quarterback. There's a reason they only asked Bagent to play one-ish drives, attempted 2 for 3 for 16 yards, because I think they're pretty darn confident in what Tyson Bagent can do. And after that first drive, he and the other, starters, or the starters for this game, the second string players for this game, came out and never really came back in. There were a handful of players that were out there initially for the first drive or so, and then beyond that, I don't know if it was one drive or two. I wasn't counting the exact numbers of plays, but it looked to me like they were able to come out after that first drive. I believe it was the second drive. Brett Rypien came in the game. The running back rotation changed. The offensive line changed slightly. The wide receivers changed slightly, but I think Bagent just played that one opening drive. That's a pretty strong ringing endorsement of him as their number 2 quarterback, but maybe Rypien's performance in this game can start to open that door a little bit more and make that more of an open competition than I think it was up to this point. For Collin Johnson at wide receiver, on the other hand, there's still room for him to push the wide receiver position here. Obviously, we know DJ Moore, number 1, Keenan Allen, number 2, Rome Odunze, number 3, or in whatever order you want to put them. That's pretty well locked in. We think of Tyler Scott as number 4, given that he was a 4th-round pick last year and has shown some flashes and has been one of the better players at training camp so far that we've heard of. And then there's a real spot here for Collin Johnson to try and be wide receiver 5 or even push for wide receiver 4. He was the next wide receiver in the game after Tyler Scott. The starting wide receivers on the field were Scott on one side and Collin Johnson on the other. DeAndre Carter came in as the slot receiver, the number 3 receiver in 3 receiver sets. But in this game, the first offense to take the field was Scott, Johnson, and Carter. That would put Tyler Scott ahead of a lot of the other wide receivers on this depth chart. When you think about guys that are in this mix for the 5th wide receiver spot, Velus Jones, Dante Pettis, Freddie Swain, some other undrafted players like Simba Webster, Peter LeBlanc, John Jackson, etc. There's a lot of wide receivers competing for just a couple of spots here. And Collin Johnson not only got the first crack at it with Tyler Scott, but also clearly made the most out of it. So I'm not ready to put him on the 53-man roster. And if there was a way to bet money on this, it's not on FanDuel Sportsbook, I would bet on him making the practice squad and not making the 53-man roster. But he certainly had the best possible start you could hope for or expect from a former undrafted free agent wide receiver trying to make a name for himself. And we're still left with some questions about some of the other wide receivers on this group, including Velus Jones, who I'd like to talk about here coming up because he didn't play at all. And I'm curious as to why that is. It seems like it's either a good thing for Velus Jones or a bad thing for Velus Jones. And I'm not sure that there's a ton of middle ground there because Matt Eberflus after the game kind of said stuff's not locked in by any means there. So we'll look at some of the other winners and losers besides, of course, Brett Rypien and Collin Johnson being the big winners of this game next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. We're talking about exhaust kits, superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, and more. So whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. So Velus Jones doesn't play in this first preseason game where all the starters sit out. So does that mean he's sitting out because he's considered a starter? Or does that mean he's so far down on the depth chart that he couldn't crack the rotation in this game because the game ended early and we never even got to the fourth quarter? That's a question we don't necessarily have a clear answer to. Although after the game, Matt Eberflus was asked something along the lines of, is Velus Jones' spot as the kick return guy pretty set because he didn't get any kick return opportunities in this game? And Matt Eberflus says, no, it's wide open. That kick return job is wide open. And that kick return job started with Tyler Scott and I believe it was Greg Stroman were the first two kickoff return guys on the field for the Bears. And it wasn't like there was just one opportunity to return kicks here. It wasn't like, okay, it was Greg Stroman and Tyler Scott. It wasn't like, okay, one time and the only one time they got a chance, it happened to be those guys. No, it was 2 or 3 or 4. I don't have the exact number in front of me. Let's see. I count 4 kickoff returns for the Bears. 2 were by Tyler Scott, and the other 2 were later in the game by John Jackson, the wide receiver the undrafted free agent wide receiver we talked about earlier. So at least 4 kickoff return opportunities, none of which Velus Jones was on the field for. And I don't have an exact perfect snap count for every wide receiver snap, but I don't remember seeing Velus Jones take the field at wide receiver. So that leaves me to think of him as a loser coming out of this game as opposed to a winner, because Matt Eberflus certainly didn't do anything to quell the concerns you might have there, but it's also an extra preseason game, and I don't think his playing time in this preseason game is going to be what makes or breaks or tells us clearly whether or not he's going to make this 53-man roster. Some other winners and losers I'd like to look at from this game, guys like Austin Booker on the defensive line. I thought he wasn't perfect, wasn't stellar, like for every snap, but you didn't see it in the stat sheet per se. I don't know that he certainly didn't record a sack in this game. I'm going to double check if they gave him credit for, he got 1 tackle recorded. That's the only thing on the stat sheet. But when you go back and watch his snaps in the game, there are 2 or 3, or I didn't count them exactly, 2 or 3 or 4 plays where he puts a nice move on the offensive tackle and seems to win his pass rush rep, but then the quarterback gets rid of the ball, or the play goes away from Austin Booker in some way where it's like, if you just put him in a vacuum and you just watch him versus the tackle, he won that play. It didn't result in a stat that's going to be measurable, but there were a few of those on the pass rushing repertoire for him, especially like getting his hands in the chest of the opposing left tackle, a little bit of a bull rush there, and then made a nice inside move. And like one of those times the guard picked him up, but he still beat the tackle. So like I thought he was promising in the pass rush department. In the running game, he got washed out a time or two, and then there was a play where he gave up contain on a jet sweep that you would have liked to see him do better at. But for a 5th-round rookie in his first ever preseason game, I thought Austin Booker did well. Didn't blow you out of the water, but did well. Certainly wasn't a guy that disappeared into the mix like some of the like I thought Dominique Robinson really didn't do anything to stand out in any real shape or form, which would kind of make him a loser in this conversation, although I wasn't necessarily going to bring him up. But one other winner, quick, on the defensive line, Byron Cowart. Or Cowart? I think it's Cowart because it's Cowart. Got credited with a full sack on his strip sack, forced the fumble. The quarterback ended up falling on it, or some offensive player fumbled on it, but also was in the backfield for a couple of tackles for losses as well. I thought for Cowart, it was a little bit more of like those 4 flashes were kind of the big flashes, and I didn't see a lot else that had it wasn't as consistent. Like I thought Booker won, 2 or 3 times that didn't get a lot of credit for, whereas like Cowart won on the plays that he got all the credit for and then didn't do a lot the rest of the play. So it's kind of different styles of winning performances, but certainly for a guy who's not guaranteed anything on this 53-man roster, Cowart looked like the clear 4th defensive tackle in this rotation. Cowart and Zach Pickens started on the defensive line, and those 2 look like your top 2 backup defensive tackles behind Andrew Billings and Gervon Dexter, and that's probably what your 53-man roster looks like at this stage of the process. A couple of losers along the way here. I thought Dante Pettis, mostly because of his punt returning, he muffed a punt in a game where Velus Jones wasn't getting those opportunities, where we weren't really seeing, DeAndre Carter do a ton back there. Like this was very clearly an open punt return job. Carter got the first one, but like it's still an open opportunity there. Pettis got the next crack at it. Fair caught one of them, muffed another one. You can't muff fumbles ever, but especially not like in a competition in a preseason game like this. I'd also go with the center who started the game, but is technically kind of battling for the 3rd string center, Jerome Carvin, was bad. I mean, I don't like to crap on players if I can avoid it, but like he got beat bad 2 or 3 or 4 times throughout this game. Was just pretty darn inconsistent at the center position. They did end up bumping him to left guard later on. I thought he was a little bit better there, but like the center spot was not great when he was in the game. Doug Kramer came in afterward. I thought he was a little bit better, but Carvin really, really struggled out there at center. And then at linebacker, Amin Ogbongbemiga, even Joe Buck struggled saying his name on the broadcast, so I don't feel as bad when I say his name wrong on the podcast. But Amin Ogbongbemiga, he got beat badly on that touchdown, was out of position on a couple plays. Like Micah Baskerville with him in the lineup wasn't much better, got flagged for the holding, but also was a touchdown-saving hold, so I don't want to kill him for that. But Ogbongbemiga was signed to be a primary special teams player, and so I'm not going to write him off because he made some defensive mistakes, because he's not here to really play on defense. Like, there's a reason why we didn't see Jack Sanborn or Noah Sewell in this game. Your top 4 linebackers are locked in. Edwards, Edmonds, Sanborn, Sewell are your top 4. So then it's a question. I'm assuming Ogbongbemiga will be your 5th. Micah Baskerville could be your 6th if they end up keeping 6, but they'll probably only keep 5. But all of the other linebackers from that point rotated quite a bit throughout this game, so it wasn't very clear, who's ahead of whom other than Ogbongbemiga getting first crack at it with Micah Baskerville. And with Noah Sewell and Jack Sanborn not playing, you kind of get a sense of those guys are pretty safe and secure in their spots. The other rotations the Bears made on the defensive line and offensive lines in particular told us a lot about how we might predict this 53-man roster, the players who are most safe and the players who are still definitely fighting for their spots. So we'll get some updates on how this depth chart looks now with some real in-game preseason playing time behind it next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. And if you bet on Bears Texans in the Hall of Fame game on FanDuel, the Bears were 1.5 point underdogs. So obviously more than covered the spread, took home the win on the money line as well. But with this game hitting in the early stoppage in the third quarter, that certainly threw some things for a loop in this game. But hey, now that football season is here, you can get all of your football betting fix covered with our friends at FanDuel. And the great part is it's still the summer. And this summer, FanDuel has been hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Whether it's the Olympics right now, it's the thick of baseball season. You've still got tennis, soccer, boxing. I mean, the combat sports, you name it. They've got it all at FanDuel, all on their app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We're going to get a little bit into the real depths of Bears preseason football here. And I know that if you're a listener of the Locked On Bears podcast, that means you're a hardcore Chicago Bears fan who you want to get into the nitty-gritty of who's going to make this 53-man roster. What is this defensive line rotation going to look like? Who's going to be the backup offensive lineman they keep versus the offensive lineman they let go of? Like, that's what I want to get into here. First of all, though, before we get to the line, worth noting that Roschon Johnson got the first running back reps in this game. Khalil Herbert then came in for him, and they did a back-and-forth rotation between the two of them. It was Johnson got a drive, Herbert got a drive, Johnson got a drive, Herbert got a drive, and then they went to Felton, the running back they just recently signed. But clearly a signal that, hey, Herbert and Johnson are neck and neck in a tight battle for the number 2 running back spot. But Roschon Johnson was first for a reason. He is ahead in that running back competition. But I thought Herbert ran really well, had a nice draw play for like 19 yards, averaged 8 yards a carry. They motioned him out to wide receiver at least once I remember seeing. So they're trying to experiment with him more than just purely a running style of running back. So I wouldn't count Khalil Herbert out of that competition by any means. But Roschon Johnson is definitely a slight step ahead there. But I want to start with the offensive line because it looked a little bit more clear to me who is settled in as like pretty sure they're going to make the 53-man roster, and then who is still definitely battling for spots that are not locked in yet, but definitely up for grabs at this point. Because when you look closely at how the Bears rotated offensive linemen, they came out first drive of the game, Larry Borum at left tackle, Jatari Carter at left guard. We already mentioned Jerome Carvin at center, who struggled. then Matt Pryor at right guard, and Jake Curhan at right tackle. That was your starting group with Tyson Bagent at quarterback for just the first drive. And I say just for a reason, because after that first drive, in comes Brett Rypien at quarterback, and then in comes Bill Murray at right guard and Aviante Collins at left tackle. So after that, and they actually kept Jerome Carvin on the field for that next drive. But Larry Borum and Matt Pryor came out of the game at the same time as Brett Rypien. They played one drive, and then they were done. The rest of the offensive line rotated, but two offensive linemen in particular only played one drive. Larry Borum, Matt Pryor. That tells me those two are your safest backups, the closest thing to a lock on this 53-man roster. Like, if you had to predict the offensive linemen that make the team right now, it's your regular starters, of course, right? Braxton Jones, Tevin Jenkins, Ryan Bates, Nate Davis, Darnell Wright, plus Coleman Shelton at center gives you 6. Larry Borum's your backup tackle, gives you 7. And Matt Pryor is your backup guard, who gives you 8. And then maybe Karan Amagashi gives you 9. Or maybe Karan Amagashi spends his rookie year on the injured reserve list. I mean, at this point, you can't rule it out. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if the Bears just say, screw it, put him on IR instead of having, then he doesn't have to take up a roster spot. You can still keep all these other backup offensive linemen. You certainly wouldn't try and, you couldn't sneak him onto the practice squad or anything. So that wouldn't surprise me if you kept 8 and your 3 backups are Borum, Pryor, and Coleman Shelton. Because Borum can play both tackle spots and has played guard. Pryor can play both guard and both tackle spots, has played all 4 in the NFL before. And then, Shelton's your backup center, and Bates can play some guard too. Shelton has also played guard before in his career. So, that to me is where this offensive line is most solid. I think there's still an opportunity for the likes of Jatari Carter to battle for a guard spot, or for Jake Curhan to battle for a tackle spot. Those are probably the only two besides Karan Amagashi that have a real shot at the 53. I think a lot of the other guys, Bill Murray, Doug Kramer, Jerome Carvin, etc., probably not going to be on the 53 practice squad. Certainly a possibility there. But I think we got a good, solid update on okay, here's the backups the Bears trust the most, and here's the backups the Bears definitely still want to see more of and don't seem to have as much confidence in. We got similar answers on the defensive line, where we're trying to figure out what this Bears pass rush is going to look like. We knew Montez Sweat not going to play, Andrew Billings not going to play, DeMarcus Walker not going to play, Jervon Dexter probably not going to play, didn't play as expected. But the 5th defensive end or defensive lineman, spoiler alert, that didn't play was Jacob Martin, the free agent they signed from the Indianapolis Colts, who had previously played for the Houston Texans, the opponent in this game. He did not play in this game. He, to me, is clearly then the number 3 defensive end. It's Sweat, Walker, and Martin are 1, 2, 3. And that leaves Dominic Robinson, Austin Booker, Daniel Hardy, Khalid Kareem, Jeremy Croma. They're all competing for the 4th and maybe 5th spot if the Bears even keep 5 defensive ends. The fact that Martin didn't play puts him clearly ahead of everyone else in that group. When the Bears' starting defense came out in this game, again, starting in this game as top backups, Dominic Robinson and Daniel Hardy were your starting defensive ends. And then Zach Pickens and Byron Cowart were your defensive tackles. I think I mentioned them earlier. But interesting that Daniel Hardy gets the quote-unquote start in this game. He was a guy who the Bears had put on their practice squad last season and kept him on practice squad for pretty much the entire year. Brought him back this year. He's a former 7th-round pick out of Montana State by the Los Angeles Rams a couple of years ago. Not a guy we've heard a ton from. I think we were kind of expecting, because Austin Booker has rotated in with the starters at practice occasionally, has gotten reps with the ones that would maybe be Dominic Robinson and Austin Booker as your 2 starting defensive ends, and then everyone else behind them would rotate. But instead, it was Robinson and Hardy with Pickens and Cowart, and then Booker rotated in, and Khalid Kareem rotated in, and you saw, a defensive tackle was mostly Michael Dwumfor, and then Keith Randolph was kind of the next guy after him. But interesting that Booker was essentially 3rd string in this game, because he was 2nd string in the actual game, which started with the actual 2nd stringer, so you bump everybody down one. In terms, if the starters had played, Booker would have been 3rd string here, which is interesting. But I thought we mentioned he played pretty darn well in this game, whereas Dominic Robinson really didn't do much to write home about. Even Daniel Hardy had a tackle for a loss at some point in the play, Byron Cowart as well. But Robinson and Zach Pickens, pretty quiet against backups. Doesn't necessarily, again, small sample size, doesn't necessarily doesn't increase your confidence in them making big impacts in the regular season against starting caliber offensive linemen when they're not making huge impacts in a small sample size against backup offensive linemen. There is still a lot of preseason left, and I am in no way cutting anybody right off the roster or guaranteeing anybody's roster spot based on what we saw in the Hall of Fame game. I mean, most of these guys played 30 snaps at most, 25, 20 and fewer. That's like less than half of a full regular season NFL game. So it's nothing to get overly obsessed about or put too much weight in. What happens at the practices at training camp and in the joint practices and in the remaining preseason games will matter a lot more than what we saw in the Hall of Fame game. But at least it gives us a good glimpse into, it's kind of a snapshot of how do the Bears feel about their roster right now? How do they feel about the running backs? How do they feel about the offensive line? How do they feel about the defensive line? How do they feel about their kick returners? Here's how they feel about them on, at least during the game, August 1st. We'll see if how they feel about them changes by August 30th, or I know a cutdown day will probably be before that, but you know what I mean? We got 3 more weeks for how they feel about these players to change, and a lot of practice and preseason games can change so much about that. You can be sure we will break it down for you and keep close tabs on how all these players and these battles develop throughout training camp and the rest of the preseason. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, so that way you're keeping up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you're looking for your second listen, we're launching a new 24-hour live stream channel that's just Locked On NFL Podcasts. So we are covering all the biggest stories across the NFL, but it's just the NFL. It's just football for you, streaming 24 hours a day on the Locked On NFL YouTube channel or our free Amazon Fire TV app. If you've got the Amazon Fire TV app, you can stream it on your television for free, 24 hours a day, Locked On NFL sports coverage from all of our Locked On podcast hosts. So go check out that. You can hear the Locked On Bears podcast on there as well. Go check that out to get your daily football fix to get for your second listen. Coming back on Monday, as barring any other bigger breaking news, I want to break down kind of a preview of Hard Knocks and who we think the stars, the most interesting characters are going to be on Hard Knocks, because I think it's going to be a few names that we're not expecting, but I've got a hunch. Got a couple names that we've heard bits and pieces of that I have a feeling will be bigger stars on TV than we've heard of so far coming out of training camp. So come on back for that. We'll also break down the Hard Knocks episode after it airs and so much more. So keep making Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day. And in exchange, I promise, I will always give you another opportunity to bear down.